Okay, I'm going to get this going. It's lovely to be here with you all for what is actually our last webinar of this calendar year. We've smashed out one a fortnight. It's been very exciting. We will continue these in some manner next year, but it's been certainly very busy, considering the year before we were doing them on a weekly basis. And we thought one of the most important areas for us to provide an update on is everything in relation to the mechanics of digital marketing, how they're changing, obviously with the deprecation of third-party cookies, what we're seeing from iOS limiting IDFAs and all the rest of it, and the important work that Tech Lab are doing in this space, and some awareness and education around the various identity solutions and partners and some details therein. So we've actually created a document for this, which we're launching today. We'll share that link with you a little bit later, and we're going to talk it through, grab some slides. It's been put together by our data council. So this is being recorded, and we'll be sharing this recording out next week. But today, please feel free to provide us some questions in the Q&A tool, which we will pick up once we have the full panel involved. And we have a stellar lineup with Shailley Singh, who runs all the product work, teams, outputs across Tech Lab, as well as all the global programs. One of the busiest, smartest guys in the business, and in the industry. And we've had Shailley on a few webinars. It's wonderful to spend some time with him today. We're going to have a little dedicated Q&A with him initially, and then secondly, our chair of the council, Dan Richardson, head of data at Yahoo across Australia and New Zealand, will dive into some of the details that we've produced within the ID Explainer, which is published today. And then I'm delighted to also bring in Alison from OMD and Angelo from 9 to broaden out that industry conversation with a lively panel, no doubt, towards the end. But for now, I'm just going to open up with Shailley and talk through some of the hard work that Tech Lab have been doing in this space to get us up to speed through what was previously called Project Rearc, the project to re-architect digital marketing. So Shailley, if you can jump in.
Hello.
Welcome. Good to see you. Hope I introduced your role correctly, because I know it changed recently.
Yeah.
Yeah. As I said, one of the busiest and smartest people around, and we have featured Tech Lab often enough for us to not necessarily run into a big intro, but it's worth reminding ourselves of the hard work that they do across a number of areas that are fundamentally critical to the industry, and supporting each of the IABs that you have globally. They're a central group that work incredibly hard in and around the area of technical standards, becoming more and more important all the time. And one of the big projects kicked off was Project Rearc over 18 months ago, to collaboratively resolve for the restrictions that we're starting to see for all the capabilities we've taken for granted over the last few years, particularly in relation to the highly ubiquitous third-party cookies. So the overall work continues, and we'll talk a little bit about the progress and dive into the details in a moment. But if you look at the areas that are so important in and around the controls for consumers and enabling transparency and controls and any signals that are provided, those need to be persistent and consistent for the various scenarios and requirements that consumers will demand. And that we have to be able to build for the full suite, for the full flexibility of requirements, and being accountable in the work that we do. And we see the types of transparency standards that we become so used to adopting for programmatic transactions. We're going to see a similar approach coming in with identity and everything that's happening in this space. And we're going to talk that through a little bit with Shailley in a moment. And then being able to enjoy the capabilities that we're used to in a privacy safe manner and a responsible manner in terms of campaign controls, frequency capping, measurement, attribution, and all the rest, but doing it in kind of a new way with a number of different standards that were released. So we covered those 4 specifications that have been released in a fair amount of detail. and the timeline of work that's been fairly heavy around trying to understand the problems, publishers and solutions and use cases being put out, then reviewing the various proposals and submissions that have been received globally and collaboratively across from various member companies from everywhere has been a very interesting process. And then being able to design solutions and get into that phase of testing, which we're currently preparing for. So Shailley, in terms of the overall progress of what has been a very busy collaborative set of projects and outputs with regular meetings, how do you feel progress has been, how's the progress that you've seen through 2021 as we get into the collaborative testing for next calendar year? Is it on track?
Yeah, it's as per the plan. So we were able to kind of break down the problem into the natural buckets of how users interact with media and what kind of privacy they prefer. And based on that, earlier we released for public comments like four standards to take care of privacy signaling through the global privacy platform, accountability platform, like how the industry will hold itself accountable in managing the data of the users, and then the seller-defined audience, which is a first-party solution, and then best practices for tokenization, especially that's very relevant for today's session here. Like if you're an identity provider or a tokenization provider, like what are the best practices to observe to manage that properly? So those are the four that we released. We're looking forward to, we've got good feedback, and that feedback is being analyzed, or it's almost done analyzing that feedback from globally. So the next step is, of course, releasing the V1s as final of all of these standards, as well as there is other work in the pipeline on doing some actual work. Like one is we're participating in all the W3C forums, and I think that's looking pretty good. Like initially there was a slew of proposals and a lot of discussions, but it looks like there is some consensus forming on certain things. There's a new group called PatchCG that's been created in W3C that will focus specifically on actually creating APIs, browser APIs, etc. So I'm really excited about that all of the discussions in the last 1.5 years, they will result in something concrete happening in that group. And of course, we're also kind of discussing how the UID2 solution, which is a tokenization solution for any of the identity providers, can be taken as an industry effort rather than a company effort. So we are discussing that, like how that happens, how the governance happens, and what is needed to establish that and manage that. And then, of course, there's also going to be work on some more technology work on what are the more futuristic looking long-term solutions for what are being generally called in the industry as privacy enhancing technologies. That term's been around for 2-3 years, but we'll be working more deeply in that to things like on-device learning, multi-party computing, differential privacy. So we'll get into actual solutioning of those.
Interesting. And in terms of testing, from a regional perspective, or even here in Australia, we're building awareness. We bang the drum a fair amount, but we're very keen to put together technical working groups, certainly across the region, and get involved in the testing. Is that an approach that Tech Lab are looking to see? Because I know a lot of the work is still sitting mainly in the US and partly in Europe. Yeah, so
the work that will happen in 22 is mostly going to be open source. So it'll be, anybody will be able to join in. There'll be some governance and some work that's done in the working groups to define the roadmap and the direction. So to be part of that circle that influences that, you would need to be part of the working groups. And it's not just the working group in US. We're trying to also, like JJ is helping us in Australia. We have Shivendra in India for APAC, and we have Oliver in Europe. We're trying to establish local working groups in local time zones so they can actually participate in the actual work. But like I said, most of the work our plan is to have it open source, so anybody can participate at their leisure at any time.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's great. I know you've been doing a lot of work in that approach, and that's effectively the sort of collaborative approach that's been taken with regards to resolving for this. And we remind ourselves of the three scenarios that we're working towards, and looking firstly at unlinked first-party audiences. This is the reasons the specifications coming out in relation to nomenclature. I think some people were surprised by, just things like conventions of taxonomies, naming conventions, what you call things and how you can build seller-defined audiences around that being so important. One piece I was going to ask you in relation to this, Shailley, was around how private marketplaces function via seller-defined audiences. Could you talk us through that? Because I think that's something that confuses some.
Yeah, so in the seller-defined audience, we're basically, there's like 2 or 3 components to it. Like one, like you mentioned, is the taxonomies. So the audience and the content taxonomy, that is one big component of it. That's how you use it. The second is that we are looking at, we've provided the extensions to OpenRTB and clarifications on how to use the existing OpenRTB nodes to declare these taxonomies in a proper way. And then the third is the data transparency standard. So wherein there is also an associated compliance program with it, so that which kind of audits and certifies that your segments are properly constructed, they're consistent, and it is what you're saying it is. So that those 3 together kind of make up the whole STA solution. And so it is basically about communicating through the taxonomies, the audience that is being targeted, or that is looking at that particular impression through the pipes. So that's basically the component. Prebid's been pretty deeply involved in it. We are now running a POC in market with SSPs and DSPs participating in it right now to test everything. So hopefully like early Q1, I'm looking at January to kind of be able to release a final version 1 of it. And then the POC will still run for the quarter going forward. And then we want to put out a report on the POC.
Okay. So the second one there is essentially what we're seeing from some of the larger companies such as Google and Apple, referred to often as cohorts, but where we're specifically focusing today, in particular with the work we're doing with the ID Explainer, is very much focused around the linked one-to-one audiences. And for example, UID2, that I know a lot of work's gone into that. What's the status of Unified ID 2.0 since it's been donated to the industry by the trade desk?
Right. So as probably everyone here is likely aware that the UID2 is something that was created by TTD, and it's already functional. It's already in operation with TTD hosting and managing everything. And Prebid is already an operator to support that. So for now, what we have is the open source code, like all the source code of the different components of UID2, like the administration, the operation, and everything. That TTD already donated to the industry earlier this year. It is hosted on our Tech Lab GitHub. All the improvements and maintenance and development work is ongoing on that GitHub. So anybody can actually participate in that today. Now the thing is, like, it is not just a product that you can download and install. It's a complete system. It has to work like through the whole workflow of the programmatic. So now we are discussing at the industry level with other trade orgs and with TTD on how that management and administration is passed on to be owned by the industry. So those discussions are ongoing. I don't want to speculate on the timeline, but we are progressing pretty well there in understanding all the pieces that need to be set up. And a lot of discussion is going on the governance, like how and who's going to govern that, to make sure that everybody has a fair participation in the whole system.
Yeah, and it's a genuinely pan-industry kind of open source project. Once there's more clarification on that, we'll definitely do some sessions in Australia across APAC on that, and really look forward to that. And as the another, having the explainer to provide more information, and there's quite a lot in there. We'd initially look to build out a sort of matrix of suppliers, but actually, to have to define some of the background and the definitions. There's a lot in there, and we do lean heavily on the specifications released from Tech Lab around all user-enabled IDs. So it has formed the basis of a lot of what we're doing. Another important area, particularly here in Australia, is around all things transparency, as we're looking at. We're building up a collaborative pan-industry working group here to respond to the ACCC digital services, the platform inquiry, the submission that we'll work on there. And now we have another set of standards which align to this approach around the identity sources that can be provided transparently. Can you talk us through IDsources.json, please, Shailley, in relation to all things identity? Yeah,
so this is already in public comment, and it is in the spirit of like the other standards that we released earlier, like the ads.txt or sellers.json and buyers.json, and which basically is a way for the entity that owns that particular artifact to be able to declare the truth about it. So like in the ads.txt, the domain is telling you the truth that these are the sellers through whom I sell my inventory. So similarly, any ID provider would be telling everyone else that these are the sources from which my ID is created. And these are the IDs that I use in my transactions. And it contains details like, what is the source of the ID, which is typically the domain from which the ID is sourced, the name of the ID, like a ramp ID or UID2 or any other ID. And then if there are any transformations happening, like is it hashed, is it encrypted, what form do I obtain it in, that. And then of course, for the device platform-based IDs, we've given a whole list of how to represent a Roku ID, how to represent an IFA from iOS, other devices and platforms. Yeah. So it's basically a declaration of all of that. I think the key use case here is that as a buyer, if you're going to be using or activating a certain type of ID for your targeting, then it's good to have this information aggregated with you so that you would know exactly who you can do business with, who else is available to activate that ID or work with you on that ID. So then it becomes a transparent public resource available to anyone. Yeah. You don't have to get into one-to-one telephone discussions or email chains to understand. You can just get this information quickly and know exactly how you can do business.
Yeah, philosophically, that's something the whole industry needs to align to. And the beauty and the simplicity, it's so elegant that it's readable by machines, but also viewable by humans as per the other standards. I think that's just really neat. So we're going to do more work on this in the Q1 next year through the council, which you'll hear a bit more about. And then global privacy platform, be able to support underpinning all of this work in terms of providing for the various legislations that we're going to see all around the world. And it's we've seen Europe take the lead, but the ball has started rolling here in Australia, and you'll see more outputs from us on this, and our involvement in this directly will no doubt start preparing for, as well as the underpinning of accountability, which ties it all together, as Shailley's mentioned. So thank you, Shailley. It's good to have a reminder on all of this, and we'll keep banging the drum, and we'll keep pushing out the awareness and education, hopefully more in person too, next year rather than virtually through Zoom. So thank you very much, Shailley. I'm going to ask you to step back for the moment and mute and turn your video off, and then I'll bring Dan Richardson in, who's our council chair as well as head of data for all things at Yahoo across Australia and New Zealand.
Hi, JJ. Hey, everyone.
How are you?
Good to be here. Final one for the year. Lots happening in identity.
How about that? And you're one of two webinars doing today, right?
Yep.
So Dan has been chair of our data council for the last 18 months or so, and we've started working on this as a group. We decided that we wanted to provide a little more insight into what because it's, the narrative was there's over 100 out in market, and what do they all do? We just wanted to provide as much education as possible. Can you give us a bit more background into why the council felt this was so important and the timing?
Yeah, so I mean, earlier this year we all sat down and we thought, what are we really wanting to tackle this year with the Data Council, and the council represents both publisher and tech side, agency, brand, and one of the big things we realize is that obviously privacy is a huge priority. We're all spending a lot of time trying to understand identity solutions and how they can help us future-proof our businesses, but also do a better job for consumers. But it really is so much information out there. It's like, as I would say, drinking from a fire hydrant. And we know people getting information from the IAB, but other trade press, from tech, from partners. It's really, it's really difficult to figure out how to construct your plan, how to assess the different solutions, and forge your test and learn strategy going forward. Whether it's looking at the changes that are coming down the line through ACCC, privacy and personal data definitions, or what Google and Apple are doing. So our objective really is to standardize the information and to give a step-by-step explainer of what identity is, what the different types of sources are identity. So, we spoke about the IDsourcesjson project before. That's going to be really useful. But before that, rolls out, how do we get people ready and inform them so they can, have this guide and understand, who they should be working with. So it's been a really big body of work, a lot of collaboration from all of our council members. And thanks to all of those for participating. But we're really excited to launch this guide today.
That's great. Thank you for helping drive it. And I mean, I must admit, when we were thinking of writing the content, I thought there'd be 3 or 4 pages. Inevitably, it's blown out to sort of another handbook. But the more information, the better. And you can see there the topics that we touch upon in terms of the content. We go into what the different examples of identifiers are, having once defined them. So you're getting a bit of a peek here at some of the content, how it's put together, the different types of identifiers. And here's an example of the list itself, where we built out a matrix. At one stage, we were going to have, this is a separate document accompanied, but it just made more sense to keep it all in one. And we pulled together, this is just one of the lists, we pulled together the 20 providers that we feel are the most prevalent in market. And there's also a list of sort of others, as it were, because there are a number of others that are available globally, but not necessarily so prevalent here. So we had to try and pick it out one way or another. And sometimes defining exactly what is an independent, as it were, identity provider versus what is an identity resolution that sits within a platform that may have an ID is one sort of categorization that we had to talk through. And then, of course, we also need to refer to each of the major media agency holding groups who've put a lot of investment into their own solutions, and we've referred to sort of 5 of them in the doc too. So, there was a bit of debate around it. But I know you particularly drove around what we felt, and we could have put more information in, but you had to sort of strike the balance between something being digestible initially, where people want to get more research. Can you talk us through these sort of details and how we put them together, but why you felt some of them were particularly important?
Yeah, I mean, the matrix actually is a few pages long. So that, believe it or not, that's the short version. We had a lot of information to bring in, and as you all probably know, working with different ID providers, publishers, it's usually the language used is not always standardized. There's commercial interests at play. So our goal was to really break that down, to deconstruct that, and hit on the real objectives that we all have, which is essentially how do we understand where the data is coming from, and what's the relationship with the consumer. The huge focus is on safeguarding consent and making sure that can be passed through, but also can, I guess, evolve alongside of privacy legislation and things as well. So the consumer is top of mind. First, I'm sure, naturally, for all of us. Second is scale, and how do you apply that across all of your channels. So we broke it down to these areas in the matrix. So obviously provider, what their name is, the consent type. So is it a direct to consent relationship? Is the person collecting that consent also the producer of the ID solution? Or is there a partnership there where the ID solution is collecting consent and a hashed email, for example, from participants in a partnership or consortium? There's room for everybody, but really it has to come down to, can this consent be secured and conveyed through the ecosystem and evolve? So yeah, lots of stuff in there, but yeah, these were the big ones. Yeah, no, look, thank you for that summary. That's excellent, and no doubt we'll end up following up and doing more on this, and we'll talk a little bit about that actually in the panel. So if I could bring Shailley back and introduce Alison and Angelo into the mix, please, as we open up for the panel. And please do pop questions into the Q&A tool, which you'll have there in your Zoom console as attendees. And if there's anything particularly tricky, we can always write a blog or provide more information, or reach out once you've digested the content, and the recording will be made available as promised. So starting with yourself, Alison, from, how, with all the change to come in the next 18 to 24 months, how prepared do you feel brands and marketers are for what's to come?
Look, I think we're making great progress, and I think progress is probably the right word to use. I think, does any one brand have the solution right now? No, but nor should they. There isn't one. We're operating in an environment, I guess, where the situation and equally, the opportunities off the back of that are just constantly evolving, and no brand should have a finite solution at this point. And to be honest, I'm actually trying to even avoid using the word solution at the moment. I think it seems very finite, and this is not a finite conversation. It's anything but. So I think, what we need to be doing is simply just creating new opportunities for ourselves as brands and marketers based on new information that comes to hand almost every day, it seems, at this point. We need to be testing those opportunities, learning from them, but then moving on quite quickly to the next iteration of what those opportunities are. And, I know this is where we've been spending a lot of our time with brands, is sort of working through what that iterative roadmap looks like, I suppose. But, the conversations we're having today and truly trying to demystify and simplify this notion of identity and who's out there and how brands can potentially leverage different identity solutions is, it's another building block in that conversation. And brands should be looking to leverage that as part of creating, these opportunities as they move forward to test over the next, 6, 12, 18 months. And, I think we need to remind ourselves it's not a new conversation. Yes, Apple and Google have done a great job of bringing it to the forefront over the last sort of 6 to 12 months, but it has been going on for a lot longer than that. And therefore so has this, this conversation. So yeah, look, I think brands are preparing well, but recognizing that this is not something they can have a solution for, and it's something that we have to continue to iterate. So if you're not having a conversation, please do so. Start to educate yourselves and your teams. I think, the work that the IAB do in really trying to simplify this shift is a really big part of that, because it does become overly complex. So it's a really critical part of the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. A great response, and thank you for your involvement in not only the council but this document. And we have put in a section around just a place to start for both buyers and sellers conceptually. It's quite high level initially, but you just want to ensure that people are taking everything into consideration as they start on this journey. And we may get more pointy next year around specific advice as things evolve, but for now we provide as much awareness as we can. And look, Angelo, from a publisher's perspective or a data owner perspective, what advice can you give in terms of responsibly building out and ultimately leveraging and activating first-party data assets for marketing?
Yeah, really good question, Jonas. When I sort of look at that sort of question, I'm probably going to answer that in 4 parts and sort of adopt a bit of a more matrix approach to answering that. Probably the first consideration I would say would be having a really clearly defined data strategy. which is, why are you actually collecting the data? Is it to drive a better user experience from a personalization perspective? Is it to have a better ad experience? We're all in this industry to make sure that we're connecting advertisers with the right message in front of the consumer at the right time. At the same time too, it might be things around, driving commercialization, so that delivers a better business outcome, which means a lot more investment in content, which drives a much bigger audience. So these are all the factors you need to consider. Probably the second one is obviously the pathway to authentication. From a publisher perspective, that is not something that's going to happen overnight. It's a slow process. It's a test and learn process. So that may take months. It may take years. If you think about Nine, its pathway to authentication started in January 2016 with one particular asset, which was Nine Now. So, it's a multi-year sort of strategy in that sense, and you will learn along the way. You will pivot from time to time. Third one is probably people. I think this is sometimes missed in an overarching sort of data strategy. You've got to build those internal skill sets. You've got to have the people. Unfortunately, we're in a really tight job market now. These people are just not, hanging off a tree. You can just pick off some, great talent in the market. You're going to have to develop that. My other approach here is also don't rush to outsourcing. I'm still finding large organizations who've outsourced their data strategy. Bring the people in who can actually develop that internally, who understand the business. And then the fourth one is obviously technology and platforms. Again, probably an important consideration is don't lead with technology, lead with the data strategy. Technology is one of those four pillars. The technology platform is not your data strategy. It's supporting the overarching sort of data strategies. So they're the probably four key pillars from my perspective and a publisher perspective also.
Yeah, thank you very much. And that, sometimes referred to as transformation. It is all encompassing. It does have to be joined up. I think also, across some organizations, it becomes something run by a particular department without realizing it impacts everyone. And the talent thing is absolutely, everyone's feeling it, certainly here. So we've actually launched a working group to work on that particular area. And to add to that, Dan, I know we do provide some general advice in the doc. We kind of put that in together. Can you sort of add to what Angelo's saying there with any pointers? I mean, organizations such as yours with the ability with endpoint execution, as well as all the capabilities held more centrally, what advice can you add to what Angelo so eloquently?
Yeah, thanks, JJ. Really good point from Angelo at the end there. Technology is not a data strategy. I'd just like to pay tribute to that. You'll become very famous in your organization if you take that approach, because you'll have a really big invoice and not much achieved. But yeah, I think from the Data Council's perspective, and also from a Yahoo perspective, working across the ecosystem with publishers and brands, there's a few key considerations when assessing identity, where we have our own solution, but we also interoperate or work with other solutions as well. It's a community garden approach which we're adopting. But there's about 4 or 5 steps which we would take, and this is what we bring to life through the explainer as well. The first is to thoroughly review your strategic requirements. Angelo talked about having a clearly defined data strategy, understanding what you actually want to achieve. So if it's a publisher, what are you actually wanting to do and monetize? If you're a brand, where do you see that leading over the midterm and long term? And also to fully review, this is a really big task, but to fully review your access to first-party data, your ability to broker second-party data deals, and then how you're using third-party data. Are there any reliances there or risks? And agree on the tech required. That could be in-house. Maybe you're building something yourself, or you're white labeling something, or you're wanting to use vendors to build your authenticated strategy, as Angelo talked about before. But are they up to the task? To do that, you really need to issue an RFP, but it has to be clear and concise. We're all very short on time, so that needs to be a very very well thought through RFP. Otherwise, privacy is a huge thing as well. So not just working with the current law, but being across what's coming down the line with the new privacy draft privacy bill and how we're defining personal data. And just staying across things like our IDsourcesjson project as well. That will help. So look, this is actually all in the guide again, but that's I guess like a 4 or 5 step process, which you could play out over the course of, I would say, 12 months or more as a business.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, actually, as we're putting the content together, it became clear that we need to add some more bits to it. Like, what is a CDP? What is a clean room? Data clean room, and all these.
Yeah, lots of new acronyms, but it's all we've made sure to explain what they are and what their role is to just help with this.
And as ever, consultatively, Shailley, you've supported us with this and many of the outputs, as Tech Lab is so central to what we do across the industry. And actually, one area that inputs towards the end was a realization around the differences around tokenization versus encryption, and particularly around UID2 and their approach. So we felt therefore it was important to include that content, and thank you for that. Can you explain what the difference is there in and around all the security aspect and why it's just an important to sort of flesh it out?
Yeah, I mean, there are 2-3 different ways that people are addressing this problem to how do you pass along a PII kind of email or something without it being exposed to other parties who are not supposed to see it. Like one common method I hear is like hashing, that you take a hash algorithm, you hash it, it converts it into an alphanumeric string, and then you pass it around. That's not fully secure. Data like privacy analysts and all have shown that, I think, if I remember the number correct, it's like 0.02 cents to crack all of Universe's emails with any kind of hashing that's done. So that's not a very safe method. So basically, a hash of any known universe of things is not really hiding it. It's easily reverse engineerable. The other method is encryption, that you have a encryption using a cryptographic key, which kind of jumbles it up into another unique sort of a alphanumeric number, which is only possible to crack if you have the key. So that there are 2 methods, like there's public private key and then there's private key. So in the public private key, the public key is available to everyone. So everybody can open it up and see what's inside, but they would know that it's coming from this entity. And the secret key is like the sender receiver both share a key, and only that receiver who has that key can actually look inside the box. So UID2 kind of uses the secret key mechanism and the hashing, and it adds something else to tokenize it. So it adds something what's typically called salts and nonces, so that every time you generate a key, it's different. And only the parties with a decryption key can fully understand what's inside that. So the way UID2 works is that first you create what we call a raw UID2, which is basically a hashed version of the email. So that's an alphanumeric string. And then that is encrypted, and that is stored by advertisers and everybody else. And then when you pass it in the bit stream or in the ad request, when you're exchanging data, it is encrypted into a UID2 token using a salt or a nonce. And that is different every time. So every time the same person's data is sent in an OpenRTB transaction, it's a different token. So that's how you tokenize it. So you're adding another layer of security to make it even harder to reverse engineer. So that's in a nutshell what the UID2 system is.
Thank you, and far more eloquently put than I think we had in the doc. But I think that's interesting, and it's important because here we've got the privacy reviews underway, and the government's looking at it from a very broad perspective in terms of defining what personal information is. So I think it's important to dive into. So on that point, Ali, what's with the reviews underway, and there's some fairly tight submission deadlines all of a sudden. Can you give us a couple of pointers that you're seeing that would be good for marketers to be aware of within these 2 reviews?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think the reviews themselves, there's almost about 70 proposals, I think, as part of it. So it's quite significant and varied, I guess. But if we look at the impacts holistically and the general themes, and to be honest, you're probably picking up on a theme as a few of us are talking today, but a couple of things, definitely the definition of personal information and the notion of, how likely is it that someone could be identified, I suppose, through this piece of information. And currently the proposed definition in the review is extremely broad. And so I think, we run the risk of this encapsulating, I guess, almost too much data, which potentially is a challenge for our ecosystem. So, I'm hopeful that, a lot of the other jurisdictions around the world have had to, in some instances, review things around these definitions, review just, these privacy reforms in general to make them slightly more workable and practical. So I'm hopeful that, we can take some learnings from markets overseas. Outside of that, sort of that broad definition, I think, and this is definitely not a new conversation, but any sort of legacy process around, how we're capturing data or the data that we are capturing, how we're storing it and how we ultimately use it is going to become challenged. I do think that brands need to be reassessing, what is their right to play in this space? What is that ultimate value exchange that they are giving the consumer? Because that is going to be such a big part of the relationship that they are allowed to have post this review coming into law. And I think, beyond that, yes, this will become law and it is something that we are all going to have to abide by. But I think brands need to also have a really strong understanding of what is actually ultimately deemed compliance and value in the eyes of the consumer. Like I said, this is law and that's great and we're all going to have to do it. But beyond that, I think having a true understanding of what your actual consumer thinks is a fair and reasonable exchange, what they think is fair in terms of the data they're giving you, how clearly you're articulating that to them becomes so critical as part of this, as part of moving forward in this. So look, I'm hopeful that we end up with a solution that, obviously protects consumers first and foremost, but ultimately gives us still a digital ecosystem that can thrive and be effective. But if you get the chance to feedback, please do so. Talk to, your legal representatives and definitely get across it.
Yeah, thank you. Great answer. And we are looking to put together a collaborative response. Here as IAB Australia, I'm working with all our members, or certainly a large number of our members, councils and reg affairs types. And Angelo, I know you've got a very strong opinion in all of that and a number of things. But as your perspective as a large data owner, what else can you add to that?
Yeah, look, I won't spend a lot of time on the non-PI identifiers that Ali has done a really good job sort of explaining. I think that broad net, in effect, if I simplify it, it's if you've ever worked in the direct marketing industry, say, decade and a half ago or 2 decades ago, you're pretty sort of, aware of the Australian privacy principles. The non-PI identifiers being brought into that is really just bringing, some of those sort of privacy principles into the sort of digital sphere, which was, sort of fell outside for a whole number of reasons. The big one for me that I'm actually watching really, really closely, and I think this has a much, much more broader impact for our wider ecosystem, is the movement away from bundled consent in privacy policies to unbundled consent. And that, I think, is going to be problematic for all of us in this industry, because in effect, we're going to have to go and re-seek that consent for the different use cases that we currently use the data for, that is covered under the bundled consent. So a really good example might be things like interest-based advertising. We typically, with a bundled consent, will have, there's a compliance with, interest-based advertising, and then it might be sharing data within an organization that might have different business units or different brands, and then there might be a third one to sharing the data for third parties. If you've got to unbundle that, then you've got to be able to explain that in very simplistic terms to end consumers as to what you're doing with that type of data. So if you think about third party, you're sharing your data with third parties, you may actually have to be a little bit more explicit.
Yeah.
Because that's going to in effect cover the sharing of HEM data or hashed email data to third parties, which is completely compliant under Australian law now. The interpretation of the Act says, well, that's considered non-PI. What happens when that becomes PI? And I think that for me is one that I think we should all collectively as an industry be looking at really, really closely, because it does. It does have a major impact when you actually start to potentially think of the use cases and what that may stop.
And how's that as a consumer experience? We have to just, sort of frantically opt into all this stuff. I mean, the EU have sort of simplified it, and even that's getting some heat currently. And it does feel like a bit of a, there's an industry challenge there to look at. And we have had your online choices as a solution previously for other things. And it feels like that could be that type of approach. If we can join it up technically with all the work of Tech Lab, would be one way of approaching it. You can educate consumers and inform them what's happening and then empower them in some way. But you referred to the value exchange there for consumers, Alison, and poor experience would be a big part of that. I mean, is that being taken into consideration, the consumer experience side of things within the work of the working groups, Shailley, not just the sort of technical fixes for the potential ramifications? Is there a consumer facing aspect of it, or is that something that we'll look to build out a bit further down the line, do you think?
It'll be a little bit further down the line, and not right away. But there is, UID2 has the whole opt-out concept in it, and the administrator or the operator is supposed to manage that, so that a consumer can opt out of like all UID2 use cases. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think it's something that would potentially be looked at, but as a sort of consumer experience of everything, as we're looking to engage with them, it's a consideration for us to have a good think about. So Dan, as chair of the council, as we're here in Christmas, everyone's a bit exhausted,
Got my hat.
busy, knackered. Hopefully the socials will start. We'll see. I don't seem to have actually changed my habits, leaving the house less often than I previously have. But anyway, I'll try my best. So what, in terms of what the council's planning to do next year, can you give us some hints at what we're up to? We've produced last 18 months. There's been a handbook, contextual targeting handbook, an ID Explainer. What are we hoping for next year?
Yeah, it's been a really big year, actually, a really productive group. I think building on the data handbook, the contextual handbook was really useful, because we're all, again, hearing a lot about the relevancy of contextual signals, but trying to understand how that works in a cookieless world and what's the role of machine learning. So we're really proud of that. And now the ID Explainer. I think next year we're really looking forward getting back to events and community. So you can look forward to an event being run by the Data Council in H1. And then we're also going to have a session within the AdOps event. And that's on April 7th, 2021, so 2022. Sorry, just waiting for minutes. But also around helping raise awareness of the new projects as well. So IDsourcesjson, data label, supporting the Tech Lab, and everything that Shailley and the team are doing. We really work closely with them to bring that to market, to localize it. And finally, we're going to be supporting the industry. We're going to get really collaborative with 2 privacy reviews and related submissions. So they are very consultative, and we'll be working to review what the ACCC is bringing to us with our transparency working groups there. So as Ali said before, get involved, lots of opportunity for feedback and to tell us how these changes can align with your business or what your point of view is, so we can help shape how we work in the industry.
Thank you. Yeah, there's plenty to look forward to. And for yourself, Shailley, you've had an enormous year. You guys pump out a lot of new specs, new standards, responsible for so much that enables the industry. So is there anything that we can look forward to, even the last few weeks of the year, but particularly say next year? Do you have some sort of big rocks that you're running at?
Yeah, I mean, we'll continue at the same pace, hopefully. So one of the things to look out for immediately is OpenRDB 2.6 that's going to come out. I won't take the thunder away from our PR teams. I won't go into more details, but there's a lot there for the connected TV space in that new spec. And then, of course, next year, the North Star that we've created for next 2 years actually is in 3 parts. Like one is, of course, to do with privacy, and we talked about that earlier, the kind of open source work that we will start working on. And then the second one is connected TV, to continue supporting the growth of connected TV through standards, mainly through the cross-media video standards. So one of the things that we're going to be ready to release, it's already completed the design phase, is the Open Measurement SDK for tvOS and Android TV. That's going to cover a lot of the devices like Amazon Fire and other devices, Android-based devices, as well as we've also know that our web SDK that we released earlier this year works on a lot of the smart TVs. So we're undergoing testing right now. It'll take about 2 months. So we'll also put out a compatibility list that you can use the web SDK in, say, an X type of Samsung app, or a Chromecast or a VideoCast. So those kind of, so we're hoping to cover like 75% of CTV with open measurement. That's our goal for next year.
Right.
And third is we'll continue working on the ad fraud side and bolstering the transparency center with more and more metadata.
Fantastic. Yep. And as mentioned, with the work we'll be doing as a collaborative working group, we'll no doubt be leveraging some of the standards and work, and certainly input with IAB Tech Lab on that. So the work will continue. So there's no specific questions that really come through on the Q&A that grab me too much, I must admit. So it's, I'm going to say thank you very much to the panel. Thank you so much. There's nothing else to add. You've been wonderful. Thank you. We will share the document itself out via socials in our newsletter. So please do. Actually, we've got a question here. Let me just have a quick read. Well, there might be some uptake that we'll retrospectively write about. I do a fortnightly blog, and I'm happy to touch upon more of these topics. So we'll say thank you very much for now. Please look out for the Explainer's Guide. I think we had a link shared with you there, so please download it. We'll ensure that all the attendees receive this. And thanks once again to the panel. You've been wonderful, and have a fantastic afternoon. Thank you.